Welcome to our Feed Yard webinar series. Our topic today, I think, is very timely in terms of if you're going to spread manure, um, what are ways to avoid odor and other nuisances, especially impacting your neighbors. And this is something I think it's a good reminder for all of our beef feed yards across the state. So our speakers, Dr. Rick Kelsch, he's in the extension engineer and the biological systems engineering. Thanks for presenting today, Rick.
Thank you, Galen. Looking forward to this conversation here today. Thought we'd spend a little time on this topic of timing manure application to minimize some of the odor-related nuisances that are associated with neighbors. I think we're all aware that odor can originate from several sources on our animal feeding operations, but oftentimes the complaints that are received result from land application, and that can be because a neighbor who is not used to experiencing odor on a regular basis has a field nearby that's getting spread, and suddenly they're exposed to the odor, and a complaint can result. So with some fairly simple and quick planning, a lot of these situations can be avoided, and I'd like to walk you through a process of what you might think through when you're getting ready the day before you're spreading manure as to whether a field would be a good site or not. I thought I would start with this visual here. And what I would like you to recognize is we can't see odors, so it's hard to tell who's going to be impacted, but visualize odor dispersing very similarly to smoke or even to dust that we're generating this time of the year, associated maybe with combining of soybeans or something such as that. And think of the conditions where you have seen that smoke cloud rising into the higher elevations where it's not going to expose or be a nuisance to the neighbors around it, versus when does that smoke cloud seem to get trapped near the ground level and just travel laterally, as you see in the bottom photograph here. What are the conditions that cause each of those circumstances? Well, if we think about that top circumstance, that is probably most likely to occur on a good, bright, sunny day when the air is warming. That warming air is rising and carrying with it the odor, and then it's getting dispersed into the upper elevations away from the neighbors. And the same is very much true for odors. Also, a higher wind speed, which is probably not the conditions we have in the top photo, but wind is also good at mixing fresh air with odorous air, diluting it down to where we're less likely to experience that odor. So higher wind conditions, warming conditions are probably the preferred conditions for dispersing odors. But what we're really worried about is what causes that lower cloud of in this case, smoke to set near the ground level. And what are those conditions that we need to avoid? We've probably seen that, observed that off on the horizon, often in the evening hours. And this is a time when the air is beginning to cool. Cooling air stays near the ground level, and it essentially gets trapped. That's when we sometimes hear about things we call an inversion. And so cooling conditions, nighttime conditions, may notice it early in the evening, but that's a condition that will probably exist through all of the nighttime hours. Those are the conditions that we want to avoid or recognize as causing more risk for odor to our neighbors. And as I said, your situations you're seeing with smoke or dust are pretty similar to odor. The one difference between odor and these smoke clouds is that smoke is being caused by a heat source that causes that smoke to initially rise because of the warm air, but then as it cools down in that lower case, it's getting trapped at that elevation. And so we don't see odors ever rising. They just tend to stay right at the ground level where neighbors exist under those conditions that tend to cause that inversion. Another important thing to think about when you're going through this kind of thought process of what field to spread manure on tomorrow or not spread is to just recognize the importance of wind direction. Odors travel the same direction as the wind is moving. Odors don't disperse laterally very much at all. They certainly don't move up against the wind direction. So if we were to take the edges of a field and note the direction the wind is moving or proposed to move in a forecast, then we can pretty much define if there is a neighbor downstream that might be impacted. And so in this situation here, field B is going to create far greater risk for odor as field A. And so we would want to avoid that field B situation because of those neighbors that are downwind of that field. So knowing where the edge of the field is and the direction is very valuable for defining where that odor plume is going to be the strongest. Okay, now let's put those ideas to use. And I'm going to share with you a table that our ag meteorology folks have developed to define what are those conditions that trap gases or odors or smoke near a ground level. What are those conditions that cause some of those those inversions that can cause us problems with odor? And you'll notice that there's a number of conditions that are labeled either as very low risk, or high risk. And let's note where those high risk conditions are here and what are the conditions that are causing those. Well, first, it's nighttime conditions, and where we have very little cloud cover, less than 50%. Those high risk conditions extend over a wider range of wind speeds, as when we have nighttime conditions with clouds, where it is only the very lowest of wind speeds that are going to be of concern to us to produce those high risk conditions. So nighttime conditions, when we've got a clear sky, the air is cooling more quickly and more likely to trap those odors near the ground level. Nighttime conditions where we have cloudy are cooling less quickly, so we need the combination of nighttime conditions that are cloudy and the lower wind speeds to really cause the risk for our neighbors. So I know you're going to have to kind of keep this in mind as we go to the next two slides. So take a quick look at this. Remember, nighttime conditions, lower wind speeds, generally less than 10 miles per hour, are what we would prefer to avoid. Keep that in mind. And now I'd like to jump to a weather forecast. I've got one here that looks out about 48 hours. And across the top, we can look at the sky conditions, daytime versus nighttime. You can also see clouds versus clear conditions from that top line of information. And as you'd expect, the temperatures climb as that sun is bright, drop as nighttime conditions. So either the sky conditions or temperature is good for kind of one of the factors that we're interested in. And the second is at the bottom here, average wind speed. And I recognize these numbers are kind of small, but here we're looking through that first day at low wind speed, less than 11 miles per hour. And during those nighttime conditions, you see 11, 10, 8 miles per hour, so low wind speeds and nighttime conditions here. So if I was to look at a weather forecast, first thing I would note in terms of which fields I might target is I've got some high risk conditions on this date. So if I was to spread manure the afternoon or the day before this, I've got some risk for odor around this field. I've also got a high risk condition out here about 3 days from now. And it's hard to see if that continues through the night, but it looks like the way the winds have dropped, they've got some low wind speed, nighttime conditions. So these are the two periods that kind of raise red flags to me. Now, what do I do with this information? Okay. I might just note where these low risk yellow bars are and the very low risk, the green bars are also. Just kind of use that previous chart that we had. Now, what decisions might I make from this? Okay. If I wanted to spread manure on this date here, I would want to note that because of those high risk conditions, I want to check to see what direction the wind is blowing. In this case, to the north and northwest. So neighbors to the north and northwest are going to be at highest risk. Neighbors to the south, to the east, to the southwest probably are not at risk. So I might want to select fields that, at least I want to avoid those fields that have neighbors to the north. I might want to select a field that has neighbors to the south. Even though I'm going to have some high risk conditions, I doubt that they would experience odor on that case. So spreading manure on July 20th here, which is that date, I'm looking for fields that have neighbors only to the south, or at least neighbors that are not to the north. On the next day, the 21st, I've got sunny conditions, no concerns. I've got higher wind speeds the night after. I might spread manure here. So this would be a really good day for spreading manure on fields with neighbors in almost any direction. And I've also got a good 24 hours that I like to see when there is good drying conditions, no precipitation, pretty sunny skies, and good drying. And for a period of time will probably prevent any odors from being a concern here on the evening of the 22nd. So this date of the 21st would be an ideal time to spread manure. I want to spread manure here on the 22nd. I again want to notice the wind direction. The winds are now out of the north, blowing to the south. So I'd want to avoid fields that have neighbors to the south on July 22nd. So those are the kinds of decisions that we can make by looking at a weather forecast. And I think we can dramatically reduce the risk of neighbors if we take, what are those conditions that are going to hold odors near the ground level, red bars, and then when those red bars occur, what are the wind directions that might impact a neighbor? So let's do this for another example here. November 12th, 13th, and 14th. Where are my high-risk conditions? And what fields might I want to avoid? Well, the evening of November 12th, I've got high-risk conditions through all of the evening. And let's just focus on the November 12th because I want to apply this to a map in here just a second. So we can put up those high-risk bars here. Those should be red flags. And if I'm thinking about spreading manure on the 12th here, I want to note that I'm going to be concerned for neighbors to the south of this field and to the east. So keep that in mind that we want to avoid fields with neighbors south and east on November 12th. And let's use this field map to decide which sites I might consider. And I've got 4 alternatives. Please ignore the soil test information on this map, but these 4 sites are alternatives. The little white boxes represent the neighbors that I'm trying to work around. So would it be good to spread this site here just next to the feedlot? I don't have any neighbors to the south or east, so that would be a good site on November 12th. Even though on the second site, kind of the orange colored site, I've got some neighbors very close by. Again, none to the south or east, at least what I show for the map. So this might also be a good site. Maybe the site I'm most worried about is this green cross-hatched field. Got a neighbor directly south. And so spreading manure on the 12th might not be a good idea on that particular field. So by giving that kind of consideration to the alternative sites that you have available for spreading manure and being flexible in which field you're willing to go to, I think we can reduce a lot of these odor risk. So flight on the high risk site on November 12th would be field B. If we would have gone back to that weather report and looked at November 13th, actually on those days, the wind was going to be blowing more to the northeast. So fields such as field A become high risk on the 13th. Okay. So if you're willing to give this a try, look at a weather forecast at least 48 hours. You can get them easily 3 to 5 days in advance. Make sure you have wind direction and speed on that map, and sky conditions. Those are the two most critical. Temperature and sky conditions probably going to be pretty related. And if you've got that information, you can scan that quickly, identify your high risk conditions, note the direction of the wind on those days. I think we can avoid a lot of these challenges. Almost any weather forecasting service is going to provide that information. There's no right one to go through. I like going to this U.S. Air Aviation weather forecast simply because it creates the visual images that we saw previously, where it gives me the information I'm most interested in right next to each other. So I find that just a very convenient forecast for this purpose. But any of those forecasts are going to have that kind of information. If you want to do a little bit of reading on this, I would send you to our Manure website, manure.unl.edu, and then just search on timing manure application. That will give you to an article that will remind you of the concepts we've been through today. And if you have any questions, either Amy Schmidt or myself would be glad to answer those questions for you. So very glad to have a chance to share this idea with you. I hope this adds a tool to your toolbox that will help you minimize some of the risk for neighbors around your land application sites. Thank you.
Very good, Rick. One question, if I may, a lot focused on manure application. What about, maybe touch again on runoff water, pond water, irrigations, things? Same processes can be used for liquid, right?
And you're thinking of spreading, irrigating runoff water on the field, and who's at risk from an odor perspective. And yes, I would use the exact same thing. So if I was spreading this on July 30th, look at that weather forecast for July 30th out a few days, identify those high risk conditions. The one challenge we have with some of our holding pond runoff water is we may not have as many fields to choose from. So it may be just a yes or no situation on that day. Is it going to be a high risk day for neighbors or not?
Well, and I think also at times you may be dewatering when you don't have much choice but to dewater as well. It might be more time sensitive. And
Yes.
but do you think there's as much of a nuisance challenge with the runoff water versus manure? I know that's maybe not.
Yeah, I'd say our slurry and our solid manures are going to be more of an odor source than our diluted liquids from a holding pond. But I think I'd still go through this exercise and just be aware of the neighbors around that property and what direction they're downwind of that field for that runoff holding pond water.
Very good. As Rick alluded to, if you have questions or follow up on this topic, feel free to reach out to him or Amy. Thanks, Rick.